Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into 4 highly specific, multidisciplinary anomalies surrounding September 11, 2001. Now, we're basing this entirely on academic, legal, and journalistic sources. We're just going to look at the raw data to see what it actually tells us, completely objectively, without taking any sides. We'll be unpacking the financial, legal, and physical data that sits just outside the standard historical narrative.
Here is our roadmap for today. We are going to cover the WTC insurance battle, suspicious financial market trading, the WTC-7 collapse, the Pentagon's missing trillions, and then we'll synthesize what it all means. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. The WTC insurance battle, focusing on leasing and liability. So, $3.55 billion. That is a staggering amount of money. To understand why it matters, we have to jump back to July 2001. A consortium led by a real estate developer named Larry Silverstein finalized a 99-year lease for the World Trade Center complex. During that process, the lenders actually mandated a minimum of $3.55 billion in terrorism insurance coverage. Keep in mind, ever since the 1993 bombing, the WTC was considered a known terror risk, so these specific, massive underwriting requirements were put in place.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Because that lease was signed so close to September 11th, the final insurance policies weren't totally ironed out yet. They were operating on temporary contracts known as binders. This meant multiple insurers were legally bound by different draft forms. One draft, the Will Prop 2000 form, clearly defined a coordinated attack as one occurrence, but another draft, the Traveler's form, left the definition of occurrence completely open to interpretation. After the attacks, Silverstein's team argued that 2 planes hitting 2 buildings meant there were 2 entirely separate terrorist incidents under that undefined Traveler's form. If successful, that interpretation would entitle him to a massive $7.1 billion payout.
So what did this mean? It kicked off a massive, complex legal battle over the timeline and the wording. The courts ended up literally splitting the difference based on which insurer used which form. By 2004, a jury ruled that some insurers were subject to the 1 occurrence limit, while others were actually liable for 2 occurrences, effectively doubling the payout from those specific companies. Finally, a multi-party settlement was reached in 2007. The result? A $4.55 billion compensation payout for Silverstein. It was an unprecedented financial windfall that ultimately hinged on a very specific, ambiguously timed contractual window.
Moving on to Section 2, Suspicious Financial Market Trading, specifically looking at put options.
Take a look at this data. We're talking about a massive, highly unusual spike in put options right before the attacks. For anyone unfamiliar, a put option is basically a leveraged bet that a specific stock is going to crash. Look at United Airlines. On September 6th and 7th, put options surged 600% above ordinary market movements. Then, on September 10th, the literal day before the attacks, investors bought over 4,500 put options on American Airlines. Just to put that into perspective, the daily market average was usually just a few hundred puts. This heavily outweighed the 748 calls betting the stock would go up. There was also massive asymmetric betting against Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch, which were both major tenants of the World Trade Center.
You know, financial researchers and academics who analyzed this data pointed out something absolutely crucial. The statistical improbability of these highly targeted trades happening in a total vacuum is profound. We are talking about millions of dollars in sudden profits. In fact, for those United Airlines trades alone, $5 million in profit was left completely unclaimed at the Chicago Board Options Exchange. Analysts emphasize that data of this magnitude points very heavily toward informed investors trading on advanced knowledge.
So you might be wondering, how did official investigators handle this? Well, bodies like the SEC and the 9/11 Commission reviewed these trades and officially labeled them as innocuous. They claimed the trades were just driven by an independent newsletter or a single US-based investor with zero terror ties. However, independent analysts point out some seriously unresolved connections in the source material. For example, a large chunk of the United Airlines puts were actually purchased through Deutsche Bank Alex Brown. Until 1998, that investment firm was headed by A.B. Buzzy Krongard, who happened to be the executive director of the CIA at the time of the attacks. But despite those links, the official book on these specific trades was closed.
All right, let's shift gears to Section 3, the WTC-7 collapse and structural engineering.
This is the huge question that sits right at the center of an ongoing debate between federal investigators and independent structural engineers. Building 7 was a massive 47-story skyscraper.
It was never struck by a plane. And yet, hours after the Twin Towers fell, it completely collapsed into its own footprint in a matter of seconds.
This really breaks down the stark contradiction we see in the engineering community. On the left, you've got the official report from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. They attribute the destruction to normal office fires that ignited from falling debris. They state that these fires caused thermal expansion, which led to the failure of a single critical beam, column 79, triggering a progressive internal collapse. On the right, you have groups of independent architects and engineers, like AE 9/11 Truth, and studies from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. They completely contradict the official stance. They argue that a fire-induced progressive collapse absolutely cannot explain the physics we saw, and that only structural collapse via the simultaneous removal of all supporting columns actually fits the visual and physical evidence.
The raw physics of this event are just fascinating. NIST actually admitted that for 2.25 seconds, WT7 was in literal freefall acceleration. Now, basic physics tells us that for a building to be in freefall, all of the structural support below it has to vanish simultaneously. It's meaning zero resistance. On top of that, a preliminary FEMA report documented evidence of rapid oxidation and liquid eutectic steel in the rubble, which means it was subjected to temperatures around 1,000 degrees Celsius. Independent engineers highlight a glaring problem with this. Standard office fires just do not reach temperatures capable of chemically liquefying structural steel like that.
But there's also a massive bureaucratic side to this that a lot of people miss. WTC-7 housed highly sensitive federal offices, including the CIA, the Secret Service, the Department of Defense, and the SEC. When that building collapsed, it resulted in the permanent destruction of massive, active federal archives. Thousands of files detailing corporate fraud investigations into giants like Enron and WorldCom were instantly wiped out. It effectively terminated multiple high-level financial investigations forever.
Which brings us to our fourth and final case study, the Pentagon's missing trillions and accounting anomalies.
2.3 trillion with a T. That is an absolutely astronomical amount of money. This is the exact amount of military transactions that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced the Pentagon simply could not track or account for. Their internal accounting systems were, by their own admission, completely broken. Now, researchers point out a really jarring timeline here. On September 10, 2001, Donald Rumsfeld publicly admits to this massive financial failure. The very next morning, September 11th, Flight 77 strikes Wedge 1 of the Pentagon, and Wedge 1 happened to be the exact location of the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. This physical attack instantly eclipsed the accounting scandal. It obliterated thousands of hard copy accounting files, invoices, and active budget ledgers. The very evidence critical to auditing that missing money was physically destroyed in the blast.
So what was the systemic fallout from this? Well, the very people, the civilian budget analysts and financial experts, along with the physical servers needed to track down that $2.3 trillion, were wiped out in an instant. The audit trail went completely cold. And interestingly, researchers note that instead of facing intense financial scrutiny after this, the Pentagon was subsequently rewarded with massive budget increases in the name of national security. This included a $48 billion bump in 2003, much of which flowed directly to private defense contractors without strict auditing in place.
Finally, Section 5, synthesizing the anomalies. Is this coincidence or systemic failure? So, we've walked through billions in uniquely timed insurance payouts. We've seen mathematically improbable stock trades betting on disaster. We've examined a steel skyscraper falling at freefall acceleration in defiance of standard thermodynamics. And we've witnessed the physical destruction of the exact offices investigating massive corporate and military financial fraud. As we wrap up, the objective data drawn from all these sources leaves us with a provocative thought. At what point does coincidence become a systemic anomaly? It really challenges us to look closely at the data and to always seek a deeper understanding when we assess historical events and systemic risk. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. I hope this helps you see the data in a whole new light.